All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Mindgasms. So, as you can see on the screen there, I'm going to talk about Nietzsche's famous book called The Antichrist. And he, of course, was a famous existentialist philosopher. And I guess I'll explain what existentialism is first here. So, existentialism is, according to the dictionary anyway, a theory or approach which emphasizes the existence of the individual person as a free and responsible agent determining their own development through the acts of will. Existentialism is a form of philosophically inquiry that explores the problem of human existence and centers on the lived experience of the thinking, feeling, acting individual. Now, contrary to popular belief, Nietzsche actually was not a nihilist, as some people claim. A lot of people claim that he was a nihilist, meaning that basically that their life has no meaning, and it doesn't necessarily go into pessimism, but a lot of people associate it with pessimism too. And of course, Nietzsche was like, he notoriously went insane, but he never, like, as far as I know anyway, he never became a nihilist even then. So here is nihilism, the belief that all values are baseless and nothing can be known. So a lot of people, like I said, claim that Nietzsche was a nihilist, and he thought that, there aren't any values, we shouldn't promote any values, it's just pointless, there's no meaning to life. And Nietzsche actually offered a response to nihilism, which was existentialism, as I said, which is the idea that it's not that there are no values, it's that there are no inherent values, therefore you should choose your own. So the meaning of life can be whatever you want it to be, which I really like. And it reminds me of one of my favorite nonfiction books by one of my favorite nonfiction authors, Viktor Frankl, called Man's Search for Meaning. And this is Viktor Frankl here. I think this is a great quote. Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. And I think that's great because, for those of you who don't know, he wrote the book called the one that I just said, Man's Search for Meaning, and it was about his perspective as a Holocaust survivor. So it was about his experience during the Holocaust and how he survived it by having the mindset that, the Nazis can take everything away from me except how I respond to what happens to me. They can't take away my mindset about it, which I think is really fucking powerful, which is why I love that book so much. So anyway, I guess I should show you a picture of Nietzsche here. I know a lot of people already know what he looks like. He looks like that angry guy with a mustache, basically. So let's go to a picture here. I think I have it down at the bottom. Oh, there we go. There is Nietzsche. And I got that funny cartoon picture of him flipping someone off, because this is basically his attitude towards Christianity throughout the book, The Antichrist. He's just ruthlessly fucking critical of Christianity and thinks that there's nothing good about it, and he just thinks that there aren't any benefits whatsoever, just like militant atheists, like the famous four horsemen, like Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, and Daniel Dennett, of course. And here's a picture of angry Sam Harris, because he always seems to be angry about everything and offended at everyone, and everyone apparently gets his arguments wrong all the time. And I honestly used to be a huge fan of his, but then I stopped being a militant atheist because I discovered the work of Jonathan Haidt. And he wrote this, he's a social psychologist, and he wrote some really great books called The Happiness Hypothesis and The Righteous Mind. And I'll pull up a picture here of Jonathan Haidt. He wrote some really great books that actually changed my mind and stopped me from being a militant atheist in combination with a lot of other things. Because I learned that scientifically speaking, it's been scientifically investigated and found to be true that we don't actually behave rationally, contrary to what people like Sam Harris fucking say, and contrary to the way he wants everyone to be, because we actually just have our intuitive responses, and then we rationalize from those. So we're not actually rationalistic. And Jonathan Haidt also points out in his books The Happiness Hypothesis and The Righteous Mind he talks about this idea of group selection, that religions actually have some psychologically and morally true claims, which is why they have been adapted by evolution, and they've been selected for through group selection, this idea of a group selecting a psychological trait and then it being carried forth in evolution, which is why there are so many religions that still last today. So anyway, after that preamble here, I'll get into the notes that I thought were the most interesting about the book. So one of the claims that Nietzsche makes, some of which I agree and some of which I disagree with, because like I said, I'm not a militant atheist anymore. One of the claims that he makes is that Jesus was the only Christian, which I think is really interesting. He doesn't go into detail about that, if I remember correctly. And here's a stereotypical picture of Jesus, of course. And I think it's basically Nietzsche's claim that Nietzsche was the only Christian, because he talks at one point about how Jesus taught these most important claims, which some of my Christian friends say are the most important Christian claims and the most important claims in the Bible, which are to love everyone as yourself and to love God. So basically, he thought that Jesus was the only Christian because he was the only person who did that, and every other Christian, apparently, they didn't follow those teachings of Jesus, because to Nietzsche, Christians on average, they're always like moralizing to people and judging people. And in the Bible it says, "Judge not lest ye be judged." He wasn't about like going around to moralizing people. He was about loving people, which is why Nietzsche rather says that Jesus was the only Christian. So another interesting claim that Nietzsche makes is that Pontius Pilate was the only character in the Bible worthy of honor. And of course, a lot of people know that Pontius Pilate was the person who Jesus was brought before. He was in charge at the time, and he was given the decision about whether to condemn Jesus to death or not. And I'll show you a picture of Pilate here. Pontius Pilate, that's the typical depiction of him being this, like authoritarian ruler, of course. And it's interesting, I didn't remember this until I just looked it up, because I read the Bible before, but I didn't remember this, that Pilate initially, at least according to the Bible, apparently historical sources say that he was actually more authoritarian and ruthless than the way he is depicted in the Bible, which I think is interesting, because you would think it would be the opposite, and that the Bible would present Pilate as less favorably than history, right? Because you would think that they want to paint him as the villain and paint Jesus as the good guy. So I think that's interesting that in the Bible, Pilate exonerates Jesus at first, but then because the crowd overwhelmingly disapproves with this decision, he ends up condemning him to death after that, death by crucifixion, of course, which I think is really interesting because it gets to another one of Nietzsche's claims, which is that Pontius Pilate was the only character in the Bible worthy of honor. And I think that's a really interesting claim. And that's another one that I don't agree with, but again, I think it's really interesting because it's kind of the claim that, no one else is as good of a person as Pilate. And I don't think he fully elaborates on that, but in terms of what I know about Nietzsche, I know that Pilate asked what is true. So he's going into this philosophical investigation, and he actually, he exonerates Jesus, and then due to the will of the crowd, he changes his mind. So he's following the will of the people, right? And Nietzsche actually writes really, really critically about truth in a lot of his writing too. So, and Pilate could be even said to be asking like whether the Christian God is true or not, right? And here's a pretty cool GIF of truth. And so Nietzsche criticizes the idea of truth really harshly, and basically he's against the idea of objective truth. And that's another idea that I personally agree with him about. And when I used to be a militant atheist, I believed in objective truth, but now I believe in subjective truth, and that people going around making objective truth claims is just a way to be authoritarian, which is what I think Nietzsche would probably say about something like that. So it's interesting that he looks at Pilate that way, and it's of course a really radical way to look at it, and I just think it's really interesting. But anyway, so Nietzsche's other interesting claims in the book are, he talks about, after he talks about Pilate, he says that Christians live against the values that Jesus promoted, like I said, which are loving everyone and loving God. And he gets into talking about Buddhism as well. So he talks about how Buddhism is better because it's about seeking rational enlightenment without the belief in a God. And Christianity teaches us to live against our nature by pursuing truth and moralizing, which is again against what Jesus taught. Again, Nietzsche talks about how Jesus taught us to love each other as we love ourselves and to love God, right? So, and he likes Buddhism more because I think it's actually because he sees it about love, and he talks about how Buddhism is this idea of spirituality, and here's like a stereotypical image of the Buddha meditating there in tranquility, reaching ataraxia, and I think that's really interesting, and I agree with some of that for sure. But then this aspect of rationalism that he mentions, I think, is also really interesting, because even though he makes some criticisms like that one, for example, that make it sound like he is a rationalist, Nietzsche actually was not a rationalist. He actually heavily criticized rationalism, which is even though he has unimaginably harsh critiques of religion, it's why he's different from militant atheists in that they really care about truth a lot. He heavily criticizes it, and in the same way, he was not a rationalist. In the same way that he was not a nihilist, as people claim, he was an existentialist, of course. So this is a good picture of rationalism. The classic thinking human with his head resting on his fist, and then this scientist with all the buzzwords that scientists like to use: materials, hypothesis, conclusion, the scientific method, which I think Nietzsche would agree the scientific method is a good thing. And he basically kind of falls into this this critique of religion based on it supposedly being the enemy of science, which I think is kind of fucking stupid. That's another claim that I personally used to believe when I was a militant atheist, but I don't anymore. And I think that, there are religious scientists, and religion and science are not necessarily in opposition to each other. You can be a religious person and not let that interfere with your scientific investigation if you're a scientist. And, like I said, you can be a religious scientist, and being religious doesn't mean you have to be against science. In the same way that if you're a scientist, you don't have to be against religion. It's not like they're actually natural enemies of each other. So anyway, let's get into more of the claims that Nietzsche makes here. So after he talks about Buddhism, and he talks about what Jesus actually taught, loving yourself, loving your neighbor as loving yourself. He talks about how science is apparently the original sin according to Christianity, which I think is really interesting. And it gets into one of the ways that he kind of sounds like a rationalist, militant atheist again, right? Because he's saying that, religion goes against the very nature of science, which is really stupid. But anyway, I think this is a really cool picture to represent science. It goes into, like, I'm not really sure what that is. It's maybe like an atom or something biological. I can't really tell. That looks like maybe a little bit of the genetic code right there. But I just thought that was an interesting picture to represent science. But anyway, yeah, he thought that priests basically prosecute science, and that religion, and that Christianity and Christian priests in particular, they ruin science and culture, and viewing science as sin is just a way to control people to have this authoritarian Christian rule over society, right? So again, he had this idea that science is a sin according to Christians. And yeah, certainly some Christians had views like that. But again, it's not necessarily the case that religion is against science in principle, even though historically speaking, you can talk about many scientists who were burned at the stake for, suggesting a different way of that the world was organized. I forget what those words are, but that rather than the Earth being the center of the universe, the sun is, and the planets revolve around it, and the planet is moving, and it's round and not flat, and all of these claims that people were prosecuted and literally killed for. So there certainly is merit to that, but it doesn't mean that religion is inherently against science, right? So one of the reasons that Nietzsche gave for this actually is that he said that Christians would apparently claim that seeking out causes for effects is immoral, since we're not accepting God's gift of creation, and we're questioning what caused God to exist, and let alone that, also whether he actually even does exist or not. So asking those questions about God, like even asking whether God exists or not, is against the nature of Christianity, according to Nietzsche. And again, this is a really oversimplified version of Christianity that he's taking down. It's kind of a straw man, but from that perspective, it makes sense. But I don't think it's actually true, because there's a whole realm of theologians asking what caused God to exist. Does God exist? And you can even go to Descartes, of course, talking about, like, asking whether God exists, and he comes to the conclusion that God does exist, and I think his logic for that argument is flawed, to be honest. But it's not as if Christians are against the idea of questioning whether God exists, although I personally sure as fuck have met some Christians that are not even opening to question whether God exists or not. So there are Christians like that for sure, but that doesn't mean that all Christians like that, and Christianity itself is inherently like that, right? So then Nietzsche gets here into talking about how sin was created by priests in order to demonize science and culture, and it was a way to control society, as I said. And then he talks about how belief in God is based on faith. And of course, everyone knows that, right? That's why militant atheists and Nietzsche have one of the reasons that they have a problem with Nietzsche is with religion rather is this idea of faith, that you can't believe in faith. I think this is a really good representation there, someone holding their hands up, like in not exactly in a praying position, but trying to embrace the cross or God or whatever. And yeah, I think that's a good image of faith. And he thinks that faith is a way to just trick people into being controlled by priests, which again is another claim that I used to believe when I was a militant atheist, but I don't agree with that anymore because as I said, as I learned from Jonathan Haidt, you can be a person of faith, and it doesn't necessarily mean like you're inherently harming society or anything like that. But again, Nietzsche gets into also specifically faith and this idea of Pascal's wager and the promise of a transcendental beyond or heaven, right? And I'll show you some images for this too. Let's see, Pascal's wager here. For those of you who don't know, I just pulled it up here. An argument in philosophy presented by the 17th century French philosopher, theologian, mathematician, and physicist Blaise Pascal. It posits that humans bet with their lives that God either exists or it does not. So basically, a lot of people are aware of this, right? Pascal's wager is the idea that you're taking a gamble that God exists. If you decide to have faith in God, then you're basically gambling. You're saying, well, heaven could be real, so just in case it's real, I should have faith in God because I could get rewards when I'm dead. And if you're a religious person, you believe that. And if you're a non-religious person like me, then you disagree with that. And I don't like fucking gambling. I think it's stupid. But again, I don't have anything against anyone who chooses to believe that. So Nietzsche gets kind of carried away with his criticism again there. And anyway, I thought this was a cool stereotypical image of heaven here. Going up in the clouds to this blinding white light, the typical notion of heaven that people have. And like one of the reasons why I think Nietzsche and I as well am so critical of heaven is it's this unrealistic utopia. I mean, obviously this might be an oversimplified version of heaven. It's this stereotypical Christian version, which I know people personally who believe in this notion of heaven, but some people have more realistic ideas of it. And then, I have Christian friends who even believe in it metaphorically. But again, regardless of what you're talking about, in my opinion, I don't see any reason whatsoever to believe in heaven. But again, to go against Nietzsche, if you do believe in heaven, it's not like there's something inherently wrong with you and you inherently have a problem with science or something like that, right? Like, I definitely know Christians who are critical of science, but I definitely also know Christians who are not critical of science at all, and they believe in heaven, but that doesn't mean that they go around thinking like gravity doesn't exist, so I'm going to go jump off this roof, and that means I can fly, basically. So again, Nietzsche is critiquing this stereotypical old-fashioned image of this angry God. I like this because it's like the Monty Python picture of God from Monty Python and the Meaning of Life. The angry, old-fashioned Old Testament God being angrily yelling down at people and telling them what to do and being all authoritarian and fucking psychopathic and all this sort of shit. So yeah, again, Nietzsche's kind of like critiquing strawmans of religion a little bit, but I think he makes some good points, but he gets carried away with other points as well. And so anyway, if Nietzsche's argument against believing in faith in terms of Pascal's wager is, what if the promise of an eternal afterlife is not fulfilled, right? If you just take it on faith that there is an afterlife and it turns out that there isn't, then what did you not do while you were alive that you might have done if you had not believed in heaven? Would you have taken more chances? You can make a lot of arguments like this, like how not gambling on the afterlife means that you can live this life more fully, perhaps, right? Which I think makes sense. And then, oh yeah, he defines faith, Nietzsche, as the ability to avoid knowing what is true, which again, I think is a really biased definition. I think it was Christopher Hitchens, the militant atheist, who said belief in something without evidence. I think that's a more apt description of faith to me, like belief based on a feeling. And again, I used to be more critical of this personally when I was a militant atheist, but I'm not anymore. I personally try to have all of my beliefs based on evidence as much as possible, but not all of them are, and I acknowledge that because I'm a human and I'm not a militant atheist, and I know that not all of our views are rational and based on evidence, but it's good to try to do that as much as possible, in my opinion, or at least have beliefs based on more evidence rather than belief based on less evidence. But anyway, and then Nietzsche gets into talking about God's supposed divine providence. I believe in God and therefore good things happen to me. So that means God is true because these good things happen, man. Which is fucking stupid. And I agree with Nietzsche about this, that it's actually just chance. It's not like I believe in God, so good things happened, therefore God exists. And it wasn't just chance. It wasn't just coincidence that I believed in God and this good stuff happened to me. Like, I won the lottery because I prayed for it. Oh, good, that means God exists. So that particular claim, I do agree with Nietzsche about. That divine providence is, in my opinion anyway, it's nothing wrong to believe in it, but I think it's fucking stupid. So, and this is again where he gets carried away. He talks about how faith in God is even more dangerous than the belief in truth and lies. And again, I mentioned he's really critical of the concept of truth and the distinction between truth and lies. And if I remember correctly, it was a while ago that I read his book or his essay about this, but I think he talks about how, this idea of the distinction, and don't quote me on this because I don't remember totally, like I said, but I think he makes this, that he claims that the distinction between truth and lies is a way for people to control people by saying, what you're saying is not truth, it's lies. So he could apply this to Christianity, and he does, because he's basically saying that priests promoting faith in God in the afterlife, they're spreading lies, which is why they're destroying culture and destroying science, because they're spreading lies about God and heaven and this sort of shit. That's what Nietzsche says. I don't think that they're lying. I think people of faith, for the most part at least, are overwhelmingly actually believe their faith claims. I mean, they're probably grifters like those millionaire TV preachers who say, you believe in God? Well, God believes in me. God wants me to be rich, so give me money, bro. Give me all your fucking money. I think people like that are fucking full of shit, especially if they're like anti-gay priests or something like that, and then, they get caught fucking gay prostitutes and doing crystal meth. Like, what was that, Ted Haggard who was caught doing that? I think so. But yeah, there are lots of people who are fucking hypocrites and probably Christian grifters, but again, I think that overwhelmingly it's the case that people of faith actually believe their claims. And so this is another claim that Nietzsche makes that I disagree with. He says laws and science do not require or rely on obedience. I agree with that I agree with him about science, in that sense to an extent, but I don't think that that's true about laws. It's not like laws are these inherent forces of the universe that people just adhere to without having to actually obey to them, right? Like, to me, and I think this is a good picture of, the Lady Justice, justice is blind, the scales of justice, they're always uh, slightly going towards one direction more than the other. But to me, the very nature of laws is that they're supposed to be obeyed. If you break the law, you get punished for it generally. Obviously, not always, because it's up to the discretion of the cops or whoever catches you doing something illegal and what it is that you're doing that's illegal. But to me, it's inherently the case that when you're talking about laws, that they should be obeyed. People want you to obey the fucking law, obviously, right? So again, so Nietzsche here gets into more about how holy books and the belief in God are nothing but ways for priests to control science and culture, which he mentioned before. And he says that, again, he said, laws and science do not require or rely on obedience, faith does. And again, I think that laws do require obedience. And again, I think you could argue that faith does require obedience, but it doesn't necessarily require an obedience. It depends on what type of God you believe in, right? Because again, I do know Christians who believe that faith requires obedience in this like authoritarian, demanding Old Testament God. But I also know Christians who they have faith in God, but they don't believe in this idea that God is always telling them what to do and it's like domineering, you have to obey God. So again, this is kind of true, this claim that Nietzsche makes, but it's also kind of a straw man too, and kind of a stretch, like a lot of his claims. Oh yeah, and this is where he gets into the claim. I mentioned nihilism earlier. He mentioned that Christians are the same as nihilists, apparently, which I think is fucking stupid. I mean, his argument seems to be that if you have faith in an eternal afterlife, kind of like what I said earlier, the great beyond or the transcendental God, then you're going to be committing your Pascal's wager to what's going to happen in the afterlife. So you're not necessarily going to focus on living as good of a life as you can, and maybe you'll make it worse for everyone else because you don't fucking care. And I can see his logic there. And again, I think some people are like that, but not all Christians are like that. So it's just this pattern he has of making a good point, but getting kind of carried away with it, which is my opinion of what he does for the most part. And oh yeah, he also talks about how he says the Renaissance was a war of the superior and more noble values of that period against Christian values. And I know that kind of makes it sound like he's a rationalist again here. But again, the Renaissance was not necessarily about promoting rationalism, and he criticized truth, and Renaissance values were not about rationalism. And I'll show you oh yeah, actually I should show you a few pictures here. I forgot to show you, there's this one here which I think is great of angry priests, because there's an angry priest pointing his finger at you, right? Because he talks about how priests want to control culture and they use faith in God to tell you what to do and to punish you for sinning and not obeying God and all this type of fucking stupid shit, right? So I think that's a great picture of priests. And let's go to the Renaissance here. That's a famous Renaissance painting. I forget what artist it is. It might have been Da Vinci or someone like that. But again, don't quote me on that. So it's this famous painting of God's finger touching Adam's finger, it is, I believe. And it's this classic image of the Renaissance. And, the Renaissance, I don't actually know what he means by Renaissance values because he didn't specifically mention that. But it's a little, from what I understand, it's a little different from Romanticism. But I honestly don't see what he means by how Renaissance values were against Christianity. That doesn't really make sense to me. But okay, so he makes a few other interesting claims here. He says Protestantism is the most impure and indestructible form of Christianity. I don't know what he means by that, but my guess is that they changed the way people saw faith in God. This gets into another thinker. So before I explain that, I'm going to show a picture of Protestantism here. Of course, a lot of people know about the Protestant Reformation. This is Martin Luther, basically the leader of the Protestant Reformation, putting his 99 Theses up on a church door, of course. And the Protestant Reformation, as a lot of people know, is a way that the way that Christianity was practiced changed. And so this is that picture here of Martin Luther putting up his 99 Theses. And so before the Protestant Reformation, priests would read the Bible in Latin to the front of the church, and their backs would be facing the congregation, so no one actually knew what the fuck the Bible actually said. They just had to take the word of whatever priest was preaching to them. And after the Protestant Reformation, the Bible was printed in German, so the German people, which is where the Protestant Reformation originally happened, could actually fucking read the Bible for themselves and draw their own conclusions rather than having to strictly adhere to the interpretations of the priests, which I think is a good thing overall. But again, my guess of what Nietzsche means is relating to Marshall McLuhan. So Marshall McLuhan, he was a Canadian philosopher, actually, and check out if you're interested. I did a few conversations with my Christian friends, Shane Kennedy and Justin Martell, about whether the Protestant Reformation was good or bad, because from Marshall McLuhan's perspective, the Protestant Reformation was overall bad. So again, Nietzsche doesn't say exactly why Protestantism is the worst form of Christianity, but he said Protestantism is the most impure and indestructible form of Christianity. So my guess, if he's going with Marshall McLuhan's criticism, is that what Marshall McLuhan said is that Protestantism changed the way that people saw faith in God as more of a concept than into more of a concept that you think about rather than an intuition or a feeling or a sense, kind of like what faith actually is like, right? And apparently took the mystery out of God and faith. And Marshall McLuhan was Catholic, so this was his Catholic critique of Protestantism, which makes sense, right? Because there's obviously a long history of Protestants and Catholics being at each other's throat over these little differences in their Christian beliefs. But anyway, so in conclusion, as I said at the beginning, Nietzsche really fucking hates Christianity, thinks that it's the worst thing ever, and that there's nothing good about it. And again, I think that he makes some good points, some really good points, but then some bad points too. So I think overall, him being so critical of Christianity was kind of fucking stupid. So anyway, like I say in the title, Nietzsche was overall fucking wrong about Christianity. And I'm saying this as an atheist. So Nietzsche was awesome because he was radical and I love him overall. But yeah, he was wrong about Christianity. So, like I always say, thanks to those of you who watched this video. I know this was a longer one, but I think it's a really important and seminal book, and I wanted to get into it. So, thanks to those of you who watched this. Please comment and let me know your thoughts about Nietzsche's opinions about religion. Thanks to everyone who clicks the like button on this video. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and click that bell for when I come out with my next videos. I'm going